I can't tell you what a great honor it is and what a great privilege. You want to hear about some amazing things this morning from an amazing person that God has brought into our midst. So I thank you, praise you, and let's celebrate as we welcome Terry Caffey to share his testimony.
Good morning. It is so good to be here at the Methodist Church here in Flora, Indiana. I tell you, I'm not in Texas anymore. I woke up this morning, there was frost on my rental car down in the south, so I realized I wasn't in Texas anymore. But I tell you, I've had just a great time so far. I thank you for your hospitality. I say a special thank you for Pastor Jeff. Thank you for this opportunity for you sharing your pulpit this morning. A special thanks to the Mays family, who has been so graciously humble to open their home. I woke up this morning and had a coffee pot there, and there's some muffins there, and I realized this wasn't the Motel 6, you know. So I just felt right at home, so thank you for opening your home to me. That's such a blessing. Thank you, Brother Nate, you and your lovely wife, for the commitment that you've made to the young people here at this church and this community. I can see your love after y'all's love. That's why I spoke with you last night over dinner. So appreciate your service and work. And Miss Garnett, thank you so much for reaching out to me and making this possible. And oh, there she is right there. I was looking for you. Thank you so much. Wonderful lady. And that just goes to show you that God can use you no matter your age, whether you're young or old. And I'm so thankful that God is using you, and you've certainly been a blessing to me. So, but before I go any further and I share my testimony, what God has laid in my heart, I first of all want to say this, that this morning it's all about Him and not me. You know, I didn't come just to share a sad, tragic story, but I came to share this story, and that's the story of Jesus Christ and His love for you. So my prayer this morning, as you listen to my testimony and this story that I'm going to share with you, let me say that it's God's story first. God's given me this testimony, but I want to honor Him most of all. You know, when I served as youth pastor before going into full-time ministry, and there I was working with our youth for many years there, me and my wife, Penny. We would go and listen to testimonies. Maybe we'd have people come into our church, or we would take our youth to go hear testimonies from various places. And I'd often walk away, and I would look at my wife, and I'd say, you know, I just walked away empty because it was always about them and what they accomplished. And I just don't want to come across it that way this morning, because I want to walk away today and it be all about Him. You know, you are going to hear a sad, tragic story this morning, but I'm not going to just share that sad, tragic story and leave you there. I want to take you down a very dark road where my life just hit rock bottom. But I don't want to leave you there. I want to show you where God has brought me today. And then when you leave today, I want you to walk away and say, our God is good. He is merciful, and He is graceful. So I just pray that you'll just remember that as you listen to my testimony and what God has laid on my heart, that I want to say, first of all, that it's all about Him this morning. So again, thank you so much for having me. But before I share my testimony, I'd like to share a little bit about the ministry and what God is doing. I started Across American Ministries about 5-6 years ago. Now I'm in full-time ministry. This is what I do full-time now. And God has certainly blessed the ministry as I get to travel the country and share my testimony and get to preach some and do a lot of youth events and things like that. But God has opened many doors. He's given me a platform to speak as I share my testimony. I'm the author also of the book Terror by Night. I know that some of you were back at my table. I've got a table set up in there at the back of the church. So feel free to come and check out our table. I am the author of Terror by Night, working on a second book as well. But be praying about that. But I want to say this first of all. I'm not in the book selling business. As a matter of fact, I don't like to read, and I wrote a book working on the second one. So it shows you God can use anybody, I guess. But God has blessed. He's allowed me to go into many schools. To date, I've been in over 600 public schools across America. And all the proceeds of my book, Terror by Night, goes to support that school ministry. So that's one way you can give to our ministry and allow us to get into our schools and to talk to our young people about choices. And that's what I'll be doing tonight. I'll kind of shift gears a little bit tonight as I address the young people tonight. And so feel free to come back to hear what God has in store tonight for our young people. But God has allowed me to use my story in many ways. Like I said, I've been in many churches, jails, prisons, schools across America. My story's been shared on many television programs such as ABC did a program called I Survive show, and the ABC did a program called Final Witness. I've been able to share my story on the 700 Club, Good Morning America, the Katie Couric show, the Joni show, just The View, and most recently the Dr. Phil show. So God has used this, has taken it to a level I just never would have dreamed. But just to show you how God has used this, that the day I interviewed on the 700 Club, they had operators on standby, and that day over 11,000 people called in, and what a blessing that was. People who were hurting, reaching out, and they reached out to God that day. So God has used this. What Satan meant for evil, God has certainly turned this to good. I also ask that you be praying about something else. For the last year or so, I've had a Christian film writer in California who's been writing my script for a gospel movie all based on forgiveness. And it's finished, completed, and just 2 weeks ago, we were given the Dove Foundation approval, their endorsement. And they look at movie scripts that are faith-based and give their approval or disapproval. And we got their approval. And so that's great things. And so we just pray that God will take this and use this in such a way that will reach out and help people that are hurting. But before I share my testimony, what God has laid in my heart this morning, I'd like to introduce to you my family that I lost. But first of all, can I say this morning, I really didn't lose them, because I'll see them again one day. That's that blessed hope that we have as Christians. We sang those songs this morning as it gave us those blessed hope, as we looked on the screen and saw the loved ones that's going on to be with the Lord. But that gives me hope this morning, knowing I'll see my loved ones once again. But I was blessed with a wonderful family. I was married to a wonderful wife named Penny. Penny and I were married for about 18 years, and together we had 3 children, Aaron, Matthew, and Tyler. Now, Penny was a good, godly woman. She loved the Lord. God had blessed her musically. She loved music. That was her heart. She played our church piano. I was listening to the piano playing this morning so beautifully. It reminded me so much of Penny's piano playing. And she also played and sang in a gospel band. So she loved music, but she loved the Lord, and she loved her family. She'd given me 3 beautiful children. Erin was just like her mother. She loves music. God had blessed her. Erin was one of these kind of kids that other young people just gravitated to. She always had a smile on her face, just very happy, a good student, a good kid. But when Erin turned 16 years old, Erin began to change. Began to show signs of rebellion, and I'll talk more about Erin in a moment, and definitely more tonight as I address our young people. But I was also blessed with 2 sons, Matthew and Tyler. Now, Matthew, we called him Bubba. Let me tell you, he was a typical Texas Bubba. And at 13 years old at the time of his death, my Bubba stood about 6'1", 6'2", something like that, weighed about 240, and wore a size 14 shoes. That's a big boy right there. Now, you look at me thinking, how in the world did that happen? Well, certainly got that from me, right? Got that from his grandfather on his mother's side. But Matthew was a big boy, but Bubba had a big heart. He loved the Lord. He also loved music. When he was about 7 or 8 years old, he said, "Dad, would you teach me how to play the guitar?" Now, I'm not that good at all. I know G, D, and C, and that's about it. Anything else, I need a capo there to help me out. So I kind of pluck along and fake it a little bit. But I know very little. But I told Bubba, I said, "I just don't know how to play guitar. I'll get you lessons, and just show me what you know." So I set little Bubba down at the age of 7 or 8 years old, began to show him what I knew on the guitar, which is very little. But at the age of his death, at the age of 13 years old, Matthew could play the guitar as good as any grown man I'd ever heard without ever having a lesson in his life. That's a God-given talent right there. He loved the Lord. He was also talented in his writing. He loved to write. As a matter of fact, he was my inspiration to write my book, Terror by Night, and also my second book that I'm working on. He says, "When I grow up, I want to be a writer." And I said, "That's great." I mean, he's a smart young man, and so he was an inspiring writer. He was keeping a journal at school. I had no idea that he was doing this. And after the death of my family, one of his teachers came up and gave me his journal that he was keeping at school. And as I began to read through the journal, I tell you, it just blessed my heart to see the kind of how smart he was, but the heart that he had for his family and for God, of course. And I'll probably share some of his journal entries with you today before I close. But I was also blessed with a wonderful son named Tyler. What can I say about Tyler? He was 8 years old, but he was all boy. He was just like his dad. I remember one day sitting at my mama's kitchen table, Brother Jeff, we were having this conversation. And my mom looked at me. She said, "Son, one day you're going to have a boy. He's going to be just like you. And you're going to get paid back for all the grief you caused." Of course, putting in this ear and out the other. I don't think much about it. I'm sure I was giving Mom a lot of fits during that time. And, Years go by, get married, have children. Aaron came along, good kid. Bubba, Matthew, boy, the baby heart ever cried, just a good kid, good young man, never gave us any trouble, well-behaved, well-mannered, always listened. Here came Kyle. He came out kicking and screaming, never slowed down. If he was here this morning and still 8 years old, I promise his presence would be known. Because he's going to be the little boy climbing under the pew, climbing over the pew. He's jumping in a mud puddle right before Sunday school, getting into everything. If something happened, you can guarantee you he did it or he's behind the scene instigated some way, somehow. He loved to climb. The boy would climb trees, you name it. If he could climb it, he's going to climb it. Brings me to my next story, and I love to share this story everywhere I go, but I was at work one day when this happened. Penny's brother came by, knocked on the door one day. His name was Joel. Penny opens the door, she says, "What's wrong?" She could tell just immediately something's wrong by the look on Joel's face. And he says, "Sis, I don't mean to get little Tyler in trouble. I really don't, but did you know he's up on the roof?" She said, "What's he doing on the roof?" So Brother laid out why he did it, but at 5 years old, he managed to drag this 16-foot extension ladder out behind my work shed. I had this 16-foot extension ladder hanging up on my back side of my shop. Well, at 5 years old, he managed to get that thing down and drag it out. He extended that thing out, had it up on the roof, and there's little Tyler, 5 years old, up on the roof. Now, his mother comes running out. You'd have to know Penny. She was opposite of myself or Tyler. She was afraid of her own shadow. This woman was afraid of everything. Spiders, snakes, you name it, just very skittish. But her number one fear was heights. You couldn't have got this woman up on a 2-foot step ladder, much less this 16-foot extension ladder. But if you're here today, mamas, and you know you can do anything for the safety of your children, putting your own fears aside, and that's just what she did. And she gets to the top of this ladder, and she realizes what she's done and her fear of heights. And she looks down at her brother. She says, "Joel, you better not let go of this ladder. You better hold on." And now this time she's furious, and she's holding on to that ladder on the edge of the roof. She's looking up at little Tyler. She says, "Son, what are you doing up on this roof?" With this little orange cross, and looks down at his mother and says, "I was just looking around." She says, "Son, what could you possibly be looking for up on this roof?" And at 5 years old, I promise I wouldn't cry today, but at 5 years old, he looked down at his mother. He said, "Mama, I was looking for heaven." He thought if he could just get on that roof, he could get a little closer to heaven and see Jesus. Can I say this morning that little Tyler's not looking anymore? He's there with his mom and his brother and my parents, and guess what? I get to see him again one day. That's that peace, and that's that joy that I have in my heart this morning. I pray that you have that peace settled in your heart this morning. So this morning I want to honor God, and I want to honor my family this morning. You know, we was in Pastor Jeff's office earlier, and he says, God has blessed you. You've used this to honor God, and what an example of God's grace. But he said, I know you have to have those times where it's difficult. You just have to get along. And I said, yes, the holidays are tough, and those birthdays. And there's those times that, if you've lost a loved one, you know that void and that it leaves in your heart. And there's those times I have to get alone and just have a good cry. Those holidays are tough. Just last year, I can remember waking up with my new family, my wife and her cooking. I woke up to the smell of turkey and dressing. And I got up and I just had to go back to the old home place, and I drove there 45 minutes to an hour to my old home place early that morning. And I get out and look over to where my house once stood, and now it's just an open field. And I just stood there and I closed my eyes, and as I stood there and closed my eyes, I could just almost smell Thanksgiving dinner. I could hear the children out playing in the yard, and I opened my eyes, and there's just an empty field again. So yes, it leaves that void in your heart. So if you've lost that loved one, you know that emptiness that it leaves. But I pray that today that you'll know that God does care about you, that He does love you. As I begin to think about all the pain and suffering that I went through in my life back on March 1st, 2008. It seems like so long ago, but there's times it just seems like it was just yesterday. And this morning as I got up sipping on coffee and watching the sun rise there at the maze, watching the sun come up in that beautiful place, I began to reflect back on my own life and how broken it was at one time. And it was so broken I felt that God could never put my life back together again. And as I'm sitting there this morning sipping on coffee, I began to think about that old familiar nursery rhyme, Humpty Dumpty. You know the story. Humpty Dumpty goes something like this. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, and Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. And all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. You see, to some degree, Humpty Dumpty's story is your story. It's my story. You see, life just has a way sometimes of bringing hurt and pain that leaves you so broken that you feel that no one could ever put you back together again. Some of you here know the pain of divorce. Others of us know the pain of losing a loved one to the grave. Many of us know the pain of addictions. Teens know the pain of feeling disconnected to their parents. And parents know the pain of having to let their teenagers go to make their own choices only to suffer the consequences. Many know the pain of their life slowly changing due to health issues. But all of us know the pain of loneliness. The truth is, there's not a person in this room today who does not hold some pain in their heart and life. You see, pain and suffering is the story of our lives today. But one of the most encouraging storylines in the Bible is that God is looking to heal the hurting. He's looking to bind the wounds of the broken. If I could borrow the words from the prophet Isaiah this morning, the Lord has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound. Can I say this morning that only God could turn a test into a testimony, a mess into a message, and a trial into a triumph? Again, I want to say this morning, it's all about Him and not me. I prayed this morning that you won't listen to this old country boy from East Texas, but this morning you'll listen to the Holy Spirit. You see, I'll be the first to tell you I'm not the greatest preacher you've ever heard. I'm not the greatest speaker. And I'm certainly not the greatest communicator of words, as I even fumble for words to say this morning. But I'm reminded of what the late President Ronald Reagan once said. He said, I may not be remembered as the greatest communicator, but only if I can be remembered as one who communicated great things. And I want to communicate some great things to you this morning. And the great thing is, listen, God does care about you. God loves you. And He has a purpose. And He has a plan for your life. This morning I want to read from some scriptures over in the book of Romans chapter 12. I don't have a lot of scripture reading this morning, but I really thought this really applies to what I'm going to share with you this morning as I share my testimony and speak on the subject of forgiveness. Back when I stood before the two young men that murdered my family, there in the courtroom I stood there and I read these scriptures here in Romans chapter 12. In Romans chapter 12, verse 14, the Bible says, bless them which persecute you, bless and curse not. It goes on to say in verse 17, recompense to no man evil for evil, provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it be possible, as much that lieth within you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if thy enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing, thou shalt heap coals of fire upon his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. I tell you, I had a hard time from the very beginning with verse number 14, where it says, bless them which persecute you, bless and curse not. You know, I tell you, forgiveness is a simple word, but I tell you, it's one of the hardest things that I notice that people really struggle with. You know, sometimes just by words spoken, it hurts us. Somebody hurts us. And what's the natural response? We want to get even when somebody hurts us. We want them to pay. We want them to feel the same pain that we feel. And I was no different. I was so angry at these two young men that took my family's life. I want to take you back and talk for you just a moment about Erin. And I'll talk more about her tonight. Erin came from a good home, but Erin began to make wrong choices. And I'll talk to young people tonight about choices. Be careful of the choices you make, because the choices you make can and will affect you for the rest of your life. And not only will they affect you, but they'll affect those around you. My daughter Erin, like I said, she was always one of these kind of girls that kids gravitated to. Always had a smile on her face. Always loved to sing at church. Very active in her youth group. But Erin began to change when she turned 16 years old. I thought, whatever this is Erin's going through, it'll pass, it'll go away. I began to think about my own years as a teenager and all the fits that I gave my parents. And I thought, well, whatever this is, it's just a phase, it's a stage that she's going through, it'll pass. Erin no longer wanted to sing at church anymore, no longer wanted to hang around a church group. That smile that she had went away. She was always very open in communication. I always tell young people, communication is very important. Talk to your parents. Talk to somebody. Talk to your youth pastor. If you got something bothering you, listen, talk about it. It's very important. Erin was always very good about that, but now Erin began to shut down. That that smile went away. She always used to dress so cute. Now she did dress sloppy, and her countenance, just everything about her began to change before our very eyes. She had met a young man by the name of Charlie Wilkerson. The first time I met Charlie, to be honest with you, I didn't like the young man. We'd worked with youth, and I try to give everybody a chance. I've worked with a lot of young people. We've even done youth camps for troubled kids. I've worked with some of the worst you can imagine. There was just something about this young man when I first met him. I remember walking into my living room for the first time, and there's Charlie sitting in my chair with his feet dangling off the side. And I walk up to Charlie and said, "Hello, you must be Charlie." And he looks at me and says, "Yeah, and you are?" I tell you, that just got all over me. I don't know about you, I'm old school. At least from the South, we're taught things like to say, "Yes, ma'am," "No, ma'am," "Yes, sir," "No, sir." And I'm thinking, if this young man's not going to respect me, how's he going to respect my daughter? I said, "Why don't you stand up and greet me like a man?" Well, he took his time getting up, and he wouldn't even look me in the eye. That was a dead giveaway right there. And he kind of gave me a half-hearted handshake and plopped back down in a chair. I remember going to my wife, who was preparing dinner in the kitchen, and I looked at my wife. I said, "There's something about this young man. I just don't know about him." And she says, "I think he's harmless. He's just a little quirky, but harmless." I said, "Oh, there's just something about him." And I tell parents all the time, listen, if something doesn't feel right, smell right, or look right, it usually isn't right. You know, people ask me all the time, "Brother Terry, if you could do things differently, what would you do differently?" I want to tell you, it's okay to trust our young people, but listen, we need to get involved in their life. If there's anywhere I went wrong, I think I trusted Aaron too much. Because I began to think, bad things happen to other people. It would never happen to us. I want to say, as parents, we need to get involved in our children's life, know who they're hanging out with, know where they're going, ask those questions. But Aaron began to change right before our very eyes. And I tell you, just kind of speed the story up, Aaron just began to get worse and worse. And we found out that she was sneaking out of the house, drinking, going places she shouldn't, and hanging around people she shouldn't. And it just broke our hearts, the road that Aaron was going down. And I remember on a Wednesday night, right before church, and I remember my wife and I, we set Aaron down on the couch right before us, and we looked at Aaron and said, "Aaron, we love you. We want what's best for you. But this young man, Charlie, is not good for you. He's leading you down the wrong road." I said, "This relationship is over." Well, I just assumed she would shed tears like girls would do, or this boy's going to go on and find somebody else, life will go on. Little did I know what was brewing behind the scene, because 2 days later, on March 1st, 2008, at 3 o'clock in the morning, her ex-boyfriend, Charlie Wilkerson, and Charles Wade burst into our bedroom and began to open fire on my wife and I. I'll never forget that sound as long as I live. We were sound asleep in our bed, but yet someone standing over shooting us in the middle of the night. I'm thinking at first maybe this is a home invasion or a robbery. Had no idea that this could be my daughter's ex-boyfriend coming in and get revenge, all because we made them break up. I remember how loud it was. And I can remember just seeing a face, but couldn't make it out who it was. It was so loud. And I began to throw my body out trying to protect my wife. And as I did, I took multiple shots in the arm and chest, and I was blown out of bed. And I'm laying on the floor in a pool of blood. I'm thinking, who is this? Who is this in my home? And God, where are you? A few moments later, I could hear footsteps leading over to my side of the bed, and I could hear heavy breathing and somebody reloading a gun. I didn't know who it was, but I just knew any minute they were going to finish me off. I found out later that this young man was Charles Wade. And Charles Wade, by the way, didn't even know us. He was a stranger to us. We didn't know him. He didn't know us. But he came along because Charlie had offered him $2,000. He would later say he needed $2,000 because he was fighting for his custody of his young son. He'd gotten a young teenage girl pregnant and was fighting for custody of his son. And he needed $2,000 for his son. And it made no sense why this young man would be willing to come murder a family for $2,000, but yet fighting for his son. But this same deranged young man aimed a gun at my back, shot 4 bullets in my back and 1 in the back of my leg. They took turns shooting me and left me there for dead. I remember going in and out of consciousness. I was waking up a few times trying to speak to see if my wife was okay, but my face is numb. I can't feel the right side of my body. I'm confused. I'm in shock. I'm thinking, who is this? Why are they here? And about that time, I could hear footsteps leading upstairs. I began to panic because I knew whoever this was, they were going after my children as well. And I'm trying to get up. I could hear my 13-year-old son, Matthew, the one we call Bubba. Bubba cried out as he said, "No, Charlie, no, please don't do this. Please, Charlie, no," as I began to beg for his life. I realized then who was in my home, why he was there. It was getting revenge, all because we made him break up with our daughter. Then I heard the gunshots. I heard Matthew being shot. I guess it was a shock of that, me being shot multiple times. As I'm trying to get up, I collapsed. I'm not sure how long I was out. When I woke up, at first I thought I was dreaming. This was a nightmare. I could smell smoke and I felt real hot. And I realized that quickly this wasn't a dream. This just happened. Not only did they come and attack us in the middle of the night, but they set my house on fire trying to cover their crime. I finally managed to get to my feet. I'm scanning the room. I can't see my wife anywhere. I don't know if she's dead or alive. I'm thinking I've got to get to my children who are upstairs, and as I go through the bedroom door, I'm just hit by a wall of flames. By this time, the house is totally engulfed. I can hear windows exploding, things falling off the wall. There was no way to get upstairs to my children. I was forced back into the bedroom. As I get into the bedroom, I'm choking on blood and smoke, and I'm confused. I'm in shock. I don't know what to do. I climbed over the mattress, over the bed, trying to get away from the smoke and flames. And as I landed on the other side, I landed beside my wife of 18 years. One look at her, I knew she was already gone. I'm not going to go into too great a detail this morning, but I tell you, when I speak to our young people, when I go into our schools and prisons, I get really real because I want our students to see what happens when you make wrong choices, when you don't listen to your parents. I want our inmates to see the impact it has on its victims. But I'll just say this, I came in not only with guns, but this samurai sword. I knew she was gone. No way to get my children out, no way to get her out. The hardest thing I did that early morning was to crawl out our bathroom window, knowing they were in there and I couldn't get them out. And I guess it was just the shock that I was in, because I'm thinking if I could just get to my neighbors, somehow we can fix this and put this back together, everything's going to be okay. But one thing I tell young people all across this country, there's certain things you can't fix, there's certain things you can't put back. You can go too far. And this was one of them. But I guess I was just in shock, so I'm thinking I've got to get to my neighbors. I got to get help. Our closest neighbors were the Gaston family. They were an elderly couple. They lived about 400 yards from where we lived. This all took place in a little rural East Texas town called Alva, Texas. We lived on about 20 acres there. And our closest neighbors were the Gastons, about 400 yards away. I couldn't see their house, but I knew the direction I needed to go. I began to make my way to my neighbors, and I remember just taking a few steps, and I would collapse and fall down in the dirt. I would drag my body with my good left arm as my right side was completely paralyzed. I would crawl on my hands and knees, just inching my way to my neighbors. The authorities said it probably took me about an hour to crawl 400 yards, the length of 4 football fields that night, trying to get help. But I remember about halfway between my property and my neighbors, I forgot about the creek that ran across there, and it was pitch dark. And I remember just standing up, taking one step, and I fell about 10 feet down into a creek bed. How I got out on the other side is just by the grace of God. As I began to dig my feet and hands into the dirt and pull myself up, grabbing onto roots and dirt, whatever I could find. As I fell on the other side of that creek bank there, I lay there on the ground with all my energy gone. I'd been shot up, not sure where I'd been shot. I was weak, lost a lot of blood. As I lay there, I looked at my burning house. It was all just going up in flames at this point. As I lay there, I realized there was no effort on my part to bring them back out. That reality had hit me, that they're all gone. And I remember dragging my body over to a tree. And as I leaned up against that tree, I looked at my house, all my memories going up in flames. And I began to say, God, just let me die. God, I have nothing to live for. Just let me say, I'm just going to die. But I could feel the hand of God saying, you need to get up and you need to keep moving. I want to encourage you this morning, whatever you're going through, whatever you're facing, don't quit, don't give up. And I remember just standing up, holding on to that tree. I can remember that morning. It was very foggy, very cool that morning. All I had on was my pajama bottoms and a t-shirt. And as I stood there frightened and cold that morning, trembling there in the darkness, I began to cry out to God and say, God, help me. God, help me. We can't make it without God's help. And I began to cry out to God, God, help me. God, help me. God, don't let me die right here. If I die here, they may never find out who did this. God, just give me the strength to make it to my neighbors. And as soon as I cried out, God, help me, I saw a light from a distance. I didn't see it there before. I later found out with my neighbors, they kept the Gastons, they kept their vinegar light on above their stove to illuminate a night light at night. And that was that faint light I saw through the window. I was on a fishing trip with a buddy of mine just months after the tragedy. I was out there in this boat, we were catching them bass, he was trying to get my mind off things. And he was the first person I really opened up to, and I went back to that night in the field. And as I began to share that story with him, as I'm sharing with you, he looked at me and said, you just shared the gospel. I didn't realize what I just said. He said, there you were between a flame and a light. You had a decision to make. And I tell you, I never looked back at that flame again. I just focused on that light. And that light is Jesus Christ. I made it to my neighbors, clapped on their front porch. They called 911. I remember the ambulance getting there, policemen. Everybody's asking me all this question. They're trying to assess my damage. I could hear a helicopter flying over. They said, we can't land the chopper. It's too foggy. There's no way to land in the field. You're going to have to get him out by ambulance. You've got to get him out quick. And I remember as they're cleaning me up, and I've just lost everything. I lost my wife and my children. My home's been burnt to the ground. The only thing I own is the clothes on my back. And as they're loading into the ambulance, they cut those off of me. Now I don't even own the clothes on my back. They get me to the hospital. Doctors and nurses are working on me. They're saying things like, he's lost a lot of blood, not sure if he's going to make it. They even called my sister and brother-in-law into a little room and said, we're not sure if your brother's going to make it. He's pretty critical. We've got to get him in the operating room quickly. Now, as I begin to clean me up and assess my damage, I'm just fighting the doctors and nurses away. I said, just let me die. I told y'all who did this, no, go get him and just let me die. I have nothing to live for. Just let me die right here. But they came to me and said, we found your daughter Erin. She's alive. And when I heard that, I had hope, something to live for. I began to fight. But that hope would be short-lived. Just not long after I found out that Erin was alive, they came to me and said, your daughter Erin has just been arrested and being charged with murder. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I remember just raising up in the hospital bed. I began to yank the tubes out of my nose, IVs out of my arms. I began to scream. I just wanted out of there. Doctors, nurses, detectives all had to come and literally lay on top of me as they strapped me to the bed. As I began to pump that morphine back into my body to calm me down, I'm just begging God, just let me die. God, I have nothing to live for. As they're wheeling me down that long hallway to the OR, the hallway was lined with family and friends. Everybody reaching out to me said, we're here for you. We love you. The whole time I'm screaming on the inside, saying, God, I don't want to live. God, I have nothing to live for. God, don't let me survive. God, just let me die. Of course, I made it to the surgery. I spent about a week and a half in the hospital. I can't even begin to describe the anger that began to set in. I can't even begin to describe the depression and all the thoughts and things that were going through my mind. I knew as long as I was in the hospital room, I didn't have to face reality. But I knew when I left the hospital, I had to bury a wife and 2 sons. Then I had a daughter in jail facing capital murder. How am I going to get through this? How am I going to live through this? There's no way I can do this. I remember one afternoon that nurse came in and said, Mr. Caffey, we've done all we can for you. We're going to send you home on outpatient physical therapy. At this time, they didn't think I'd ever have uses of my right arm. Today, I have no feeling from my fingertips to my elbow. Thank God I can still grip and use it. But I could hear the words she's saying, we're going to send you home on outpatient physical therapy, and talk about my arm. I'm thinking, I could care less if they even had an arm. I'm thinking to myself, as a matter of fact, when I get out of here, I'm going to bury my wife and children, and I'm going to take my own life, because I thought life wasn't worth living. But when she said home, something hit me when she said the word home. I began to break down and cry. My sister came to me and says, what's wrong? And I realized that I lost a wife and children. But I hadn't really thought about home yet. And I began to think about, not only did I lose my wife and children, but I began to think about all the things that I had lost all the photos, the memories there in my home. I began to think about all those photos, the things that my children made me in vacation Bible school or at school, and all those little special things that you can't replace. And I realized I had lost it all. I said, I have no home, nothing to go to. My sister said, you're going to come home with us. I have a place prepared for you there. I'll never forget that day as we leave the hospital. It's a beautiful sunshiny day, quite opposite of the day that morning that happened. And as we leave the hospital, we drive past an elementary school. As we pass that elementary school, I see children playing at recess, and the tears begin to flow. And I turned to my sister and I said, Mary, you realize I'll never see my boys ever play again. The reality began to hit me. I'll never see my boys ever walk an aisle and receive a diploma. The reality hit. I'll never send them off to college. The reality began to hit. I'll never see them walk an aisle with their lovely bride and get married and give me grandchildren. I began to realize all that I had lost. We get to my sister's house. We walk up her steps to her front door. My right arm's in a sling. I'm all bruised and battered, stitched up. In my left arm, I'm carrying a cardboard box. And in that cardboard box is everything I own in this world. Things like toothpaste, deodorant, just your basic hygiene things. But also in that same box is a Bible, this very Bible that I carry with me today. A co-worker came to the hospital right before I was discharged. He said, I want to give you this Bible. And he said, I think you ought to read the book of Job. It'll help you. I'm going to be honest with you this morning. When he gave me this Bible, the first thing I wanted to do is take it and throw it, hit him upside the head with it. Because I was angry. I was angry at God. God, where were you when I needed you? I couldn't tell you all the people that came to the hospital. And I know people mean well when you're grieving, but they say some of the dumbest things. Like, oh, your family, they're in a better place. You'll see them again. That's some of things you can say to somebody that just lost a loved one. And I knew that to be true, but I was hurting. And I remember a gentleman coming to the hospital one afternoon and said, you know, your family, they're in a better place. You will see them again. And I looked at him and said, yeah, and where are you going to go when you leave this hospital? And the reality hit him. He realized he was going home to his wife and children. He began to apologize. And I said, that's okay. I couldn't tell you how many times I heard Romans 8:28, where God causes all things that work together for good to those who love Him, to those who are called according to His purpose. I got so sick of hearing that. I tell you, when you go through deep grief, sometimes the best thing you do, the best thing to say is no words at all. If all you can do is just wrap your arm around somebody and hug them, just let them know you're there. Both are grass. Just run errands for them. Just be there for them. A lot of people came to me and said, I stayed away from you because I didn't know what to say. I was afraid I would just break down and cry. It's okay to cry when you're grieving. But I took the Bible from Roger and I said, thank you. I didn't hit him upside the head. I said, thank you. I put it in my little cardboard box. Now I'm at my sister's house. I set my cardboard box down on the floor and I get this Bible out and I set it on her coffee table. And I begin to feel around on the couch and I looked around and my sister said, what's wrong? Do you need anything? Is everything okay? And I turned to my sister. I said, do you realize just a week ago I lost my wife? I said, just a week ago I had children. I've lost it all. I had a home. And I failed to mention a week before I lost my family, my sister and I, we lost our dad. I had just buried my dad, and a week later I lost my family. And I realized that I've lost it all. A week ago I had a wife and 3 children and a home. Now I'm reduced to living on this couch, and everything I own is in that little cardboard box. I remember night after night I would stare at this Bible. The more I looked at this Bible, the more angry I'd get. I was angry at my daughter, even though she didn't come in, but she didn't stop them. I was angry at those young men that came in and took my family. I wanted them to die. I was angry at God. I remember I couldn't even sleep at night. I developed insomnia. They diagnosed me with post-traumatic stress, same thing that combat soldiers are diagnosed with. I can remember just barricading my sister's door with tables and chairs. And I was standing there at night and just guard her door, afraid someone was going to come in and get us at night. During the day, I would just take handfuls of medications, just trying to numb myself. At one time, I tried to kill myself by medications. I took just a handful of Xanaxes and antidepressants and painkillers. They said it was enough to kill a horse, but yet I'm still alive. It didn't kill me. I slept for 16 hours, but it didn't kill me. I guess God just wasn't through with me. But I remember one night, I just couldn't take it anymore. I began to plan my suicide because I thought suicide was the only answer. But I'm here to say this morning that suicide is not the answer. That tomorrow will be a better day. I was called to a school just last year where a 15-year-old girl put a gun to her head in the school parking lot and shot her and killed herself, all because her boyfriend broke up with her. I'm telling you, tomorrow will be a better day. Don't give up. But I thought that was my only hope. And I remember that early that morning before the sun rose, I planned on going to my property and killing myself. I didn't leave a note behind. I didn't want anybody to try to stop me. And when I stood up, I remember grabbing a pillow from my sister's sofa, and I threw it at this Bible and knocked it to the floor. I said, God, I'm done. I'm through. I walked out of her house that morning. I'll never forget it. I can remember it as it was yesterday. I drive the hour to my property. I get there just as the sun's coming up. I drive down the long driveway, lined with pine trees on its side, a beautiful place there in Alva, Texas. I get to the end of my driveway, and I get out of my vehicle, and I look over to my right where my 2-story cabin in the woods once stood. Now it's just a heap of ashes on the ground. And I walk over there, I look down at what used to be my life. And I begin to shake my fist at God. I said, God, why? God, why would you do this? I would later begin to feel a little guilty for asking God why, but I was sharing this with Pastor Jeff last night, that the guilt that I had for questioning God why. But I believe it's okay to ask God why when we're hurting. Because even on the cross, what did Jesus say as he cried in pain and agony? He said, my Father, why hast thou forsaken me? I felt God had forsaken me. Maybe you're here this morning, you feel like God has forsaken you. I know what that feels like. I remember how angry I was. And I remember just stepping up, and I stood right in the middle of those ashes, that place that used to be my home. And I began to cry out to God. I said, God, why did you take my family? God, why am I here? What's my purpose? Why didn't you take me? But God, why did you have to take my family? And no sooner than I said that, I was just about ready to take my life. But God showed up. But he showed up in a most unusual way that day. He showed up in a form of a piece of paper. This is a copy of the original. I have the original at home in a frame. And I knew this came from my home. I could tell because it was burnt and it was in the ashes. And I picked it up. Something compelled me to pick it up. And when I did, when I read the first line, I fell to my knees because I knew God was there and God cared about me. It said this: I couldn't understand why you'd take my family and leave me behind to struggle along without them. And I guess I may never totally understand that part of it. But I do believe that you're sovereign. You're in control. I fell on those ashes and began to cry out to God. I remember I would just begin to just waller in the ashes and moan. The words wouldn't even come. But I remember on the scripture somewhere where God says, even in our moanings and groanings, God knows what we're saying. And I remember standing to my feet, and as I began to look at myself, I'm wiping the tears and ashes away. And the thought came to my mind. I thought about David over in the Bible. I remember the story when David's son was dying. The Bible said that he covered himself in ashes, and he was mourning his son. That's how they mourned back then. But the Bible said that after his son died, what did the Bible say? That David arose, and he washed himself, and he went to worship. Oh, I can only imagine the scoffers back then, because I've heard them today. If your God is so real, why is there so much pain and suffering in this world? If there is a God, why would he allow you to lose your family in such a way? I don't have all the answers to those questions. But one thing I do know, God is sovereign. God is in control. And his ways are higher than our ways. And I knew God was going to do great things. But I began to struggle with a lot of things. I was going through a lot of anger and bitterness and all the depression. And I wanted these two young men to pay for what they did. As a matter of fact, these two young men were going to get the death penalty. They say if you're going to commit a crime, especially murder, you don't want to do it in Texas because it's an automatic death sentence. There's signs all over Texas that don't mess with Texas. I tell you, they mean that. And I wanted these boys to pay. I wanted them to die because that's how much anger I had in my heart. I remember my pastor coming to me one day and said, Brother Terry, we just need to pray for them. I said, why do I want to pray for these boys? He said, well, maybe they'll get their heart right and go to heaven. And I said, how dare I do not want these young men to walk the same streets that go my family do. I said, my words exactly were, they can die and go to hell. That's what I said. That's how much anger I had in my heart. But about 4 or 5 months later, I found out that page came from a book called Blindside. What's interesting about this book, Blindside, is I know the author, James Pence. James Pence was my children's karate instructor. James was a local pastor in the area. He's a good family friend. Matter of fact, his daughter Charlene and my daughter Erin were best of friends. They were always spending the night with one another. He's written several books. One of his latest was Blindside. He had given a copy of Blindside to my wife just months before the tragedy. That would explain why it was in my home. I remember my wife reading this book, saying, this is a great book, you ought to read it. Well, I picked it up, there was no pictures in it, so I just do it on the shelf. Now, there's no pictures in Terror by Night either, except for there's a picture of that page that I found. Maybe my second book will have some comics or something in it. But I never read the book. I had no idea really what it was about. But I tell you, it really got my attention and really brought me to my knees. And when I found out what this book was really about, it was about a man named Thomas. And the main character named Thomas in Blindside lost a wife and 2 children also, but in an automobile accident. Here it is, I just lost a wife and 2 children. Maybe God is trying to tell me something. God went on to bless Thomas, brought a woman and children back into his life. Maybe God had a purpose in my life. I began to struggle with this thing about forgiveness. I remember going back to my property to struggle with this as God began to do in my heart, that you're going to have to let this go. You got to let this go because this anger is going to eat you up. You see, anger, bitterness, and unforgiveness, they say it's like a cancer. It will eat you from the inside out. I want to say this about forgiveness, that, listen, it's not always about the other person, it's about you. The other person doesn't even have to receive it or accept it. You're just saying, hey, I refuse to let this make me bitter. And I refuse to let this make me angry. And I began to struggle. I found myself going to the court and begging and pleading for these 2 young men's lives, asking them to remove the death penalty. At first they said, no, these boys are going to get the death penalty. And I fought for these young men, wrote letters to our Attorney General in Austin, Texas. I protested, went to court, begging and pleading for these young men's lives. And I remember one day going back to my property, and I had moved me an RV camper there, and there I was living there on my property in this camper. And I began to pace the property, and I was struggling. God, why am I doing this? God, why am I begging and pleading for these 2 young men's lives? And God had to remind me. That's why I sent my son down the cross for you. I went back and I pled one more time for these young men. Finally, they came around and said, Mr. Caffey, you've been through enough. You're adamant this is what you want. If this is really what you want, we'll give them life. Of course, without the possibility of parole. I'll never forget that day in the courtroom as they lead the young people in. First, they bring in a girl by the name of Bobby Johnson. And I'm going to talk about Bobby Johnson a little bit more tonight. Bobby Johnson was 16 years old at the time. Now she's 17 years old. She was the girlfriend of Charles Wade. And she's shackled and bound, and she's in her jumpsuit. You can hear her family weeping and crying in the background. And that judge looks at Bobby and says, Bobby, why would you participate, go along with such a thing? And Bobby's response was this. She said, Judge, I didn't know this would happen. I just wanted to fit in and be a part of the crowd. All because Bobby wanted to fit in and be a part of the crowd. That judge would give Bobby 40 years in a Texas prison. They led Bobby away. You could hear her family weeping and crying in the background. Next, they bring in my daughter, Erin. She's shackled and bound. What a sight that was to see that day. As I'm standing beside her lawyer, they bring Erin to me. I hold her hand as we face that judge. And that judge looks down at Erin, now 17 years old, and gives her 2 life sentences and a 25-year stacked on that. They say if all goes well, she'll be 59 years old when she paroles. As they lead her away, she clutches me. They had to pry from my arms as they lead her away, as we're both weeping and crying. They allow me to compose myself. Next, they bring in Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade. They're shackled and bound. I stand before these 2 young men. They're in the courtroom that day. And I said, I do not condone what you did, because what you did is wrong. You'll have to pay for that for the rest of your life here on this earth. I said, but I refuse to grow into a bitter old man. And I read that scripture there in Romans. I said, be not overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. And I looked at these 2 young men, Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade. And I said, today in this court, in front of these witnesses, I want to say that I love you and that I forgive you. I think that was the hardest thing in my life to ever do. To look at these same 2 young men that came in and took my wife. The same 2 young men that took turns shooting my 13-year-old son, Matthew. These same 2 young men that took turns stabbing my 8-year-old son, Tyler, to death as he hid in an upstairs closet. But I'm looking at these 2 young men saying, I love you and I forgive you. People tell me all the time, I couldn't do that. You're right. You could. I couldn't. I don't even feel that was me there that day in the court. What a picture of the Heavenly Father. What a picture of grace. I walked out of that courtroom that day with my head held high because I knew God was going to do great things. 2 days later, I received a phone call from a reporter from the Channel 7 News out of Tyler, Texas. She said that day in the courtroom, you remember there was a cameraman standing as I was sitting beside him. I said, I remember. She said the same cameraman professed to be an atheist, said, I believe there's no God. She said, this is one of many reasons why I believe there's no God, because this loving God you're trying to tell me about would not allow this man to lose his family in such a way. But she says, as I'm forgiving these young men, there's a tear running down his cheek. And his words were this exactly. He says, wow, there's got to be something about this God you talk about. He would go on to receive Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior. You see, there's power in forgiveness, folks. There's power in forgiveness. Yes, I've come a long way since March 1st, 2008. But can I say this morning, it's only by the grace of God that I'm here today. I've come to realize that you'll never find peace and happiness in the bottles and drugs, alcohol, cars, money, and homes. Those things will come and go. But the only thing that's true and lasting is Jesus Christ. If it was not for him, I would not be here today. You know, people ask me all the time, what have you learned through this? Certainly you've learned some life lessons through this. One thing I have learned, that life is short. That life is so short to hold grudges, and hold anger and bitterness. Just not long ago, there was a young man in our community by the name of Justin. Justin was a good young man. He worked in our community. He coached Little League Baseball umpire. On one Saturday, he was to be married. That Friday, he had to work. They called him into work. He was driving to work that Friday, and I can only imagine the anticipation of Justin's mind as he's thinking about his big day, that next day getting married, and that Monday jetting off to the Bahamas for his honeymoon. But before he made it to work, Justin was struck and killed in an automobile accident. Instead of jetting off to his honeymoon that Monday, they had his funeral that day. And I realized, as I went back to my loss of my family, I realized how short life is. But also, secondly, I realized what I've learned through this is the importance of family. Can I say, don't take your family for granted? We're not promised tomorrow. I remember just 2 days before I lost my family. My son, Tyler, 8 years old, came into the living room. I just came home from a hard day at work. I was tired, and you've done that before you've come in. Just had a long day. Tyler's got his baseball glove and his ball. He tosses me my glove, lands on my chest. Come on, Daddy, let's go outside and play ball. Son, not today. I'm tired. Come on, Daddy, just for a little bit. You don't understand, son. I've had a rough day. Been a long day at work. Maybe tomorrow. Come on, Daddy, just 5 more minutes. Just give me 5 minutes. Not today, son. Maybe tomorrow. What I wouldn't give just to have 5 more minutes out there in that yard with my son. I realize how short life is. I've realized the importance of home. I reflect back on little Tyler up on that roof. When his mom asked him, son, what are you looking for? He says, Mom, I'm looking for heaven. I'm asking you this morning, what are you looking for? Are your sights set upon the things of this world, or are they set up on heaven? As I reflect back to home this morning, I think back to one of Matthew's journals that he wrote just a couple months before he was murdered. And I'd like to share that with you this morning. I told you he loved music. He says, my favorite song is Sweet Home Alabama. He says, why I like this song because it talks about home. And I like the rhythm and rhyme in that song. It helps me want to learn and play on the guitar more. I love that song for many reasons. Because it helps me learn and I listen. But more importantly, because it talks about home. You see, Matthew knew the importance of home. I realized how short life is this morning. Life is too short to hold grudges and have anger towards one another. A friend of mine sent me a text out the other morning, and I'd like to share what he said. He said it so well when he said this. He said, life is too short to argue and fight with the past. He says, count your blessings, value your loved ones, and move on with your head held high. I've done just that. I've moved on. God is blessed. I'm now remarried to a wonderful woman. I just got to adopt 3 beautiful children over the summer. And we just had a son together who's 5 months old. And we've named him Ryan Paul. I took the 2 middle names of my sons, Matthew Ryan and Tyler Paul. So now I have little Ryan Paul, 3 adopted children. God has been good. I guess I could sum it up this way this morning if I could. That the most important things in this world are really not the possessions that we hold in our hands, but the family that we hold in our heart. So I pray this morning that you, as you've heard my story, that it's not just a story of sadness and sorrow, but you see the story of hope. You see God's grace. That no matter what we go through in life, that we can get through it, but only by the grace of God. Yes, we're going to go through some hard times in this life. We're going to hit those speed bumps, and yes, we're even going to question God. God, why are we going through this? But sometimes there's the bigger picture that we can't always see. That God is lining things up. And that God wants to use you and the experiences that you've gone through to help to minister to others. So I pray this morning that if you're holding on to some grudges or some things in your life, I pray this morning that you can just give them over to God. I want to say this morning, love your family, love your church,